Yesterday, quarterback Sheduer Sanders took to Instagram and he posted a very, very interesting image in which it got a lot of people thinking, could Sheduer Sanders be the next Las Vegas Raiders quarterback? In this image, you can see current Raiders quarterback Geno Smith standing right next to Sheduer Sanders. Obviously, they're posting this image, or they're posing together, taking an image, and it got a lot of people thinking, like, is Geno Smith out there recruiting the Las Vegas Raiders next quarterback? And it's an interesting thought, right? Especially given that Geno Smith is the comp that a lot of people have for Sheduer Sanders. And I would kind of agree with that comp as well, right? It's a guy that's not like super athletic, but it's a guy that has enough athleticism that he's able to create. He's able to run away from defensive linemen. At the same time, Shedeur's best football is obviously still in front of him. And I think Geno Smith, when he came into the NFL, is kind of the same path, right? It's the same trajectory that I think Shedeur might end up on. And more than that, right? People are going to say, should the Raiders actually consider bringing in Sheduer Sanders with the 6th overall pick? I think it's an interesting thought, however you kind of look at it, right? Now, there's another thought that kind of happened for me, looking at this image. If you guys don't know this image right here is taken in Miami, Florida. And we know that because Shedeur tagged one of his friends. His friend here also in this image, you can see Geno, Shedeur, and then the friend. The friend tagged Miami, Florida. And if you go through some of these pictures, it's pretty clear they're in Miami. You can just kind of tell by the background that that's where they're at. But it's interesting because Sheduer Sanders being with Geno Smith kind of puts into context why Geno Smith hasn't actually been announced with the Las Vegas Raiders, at least in terms of the presser and those type of things. 2 weeks ago, Geno Smith was also working out with a couple of NFL players. Stephon Diggs was one of them. I think CeeDee Lamb might have been there as well. But Geno Smith was at a training facility in Florida. And again, Geno Smith has apparently been in Florida now for a couple of weeks. And it's interesting to think, has Geno Smith not actually been to Vegas? Has he not actually been in the locker room and kind of gotten his foot into the building? It's an interesting thought, especially given the fact that Geno Smith apparently wants an extension. And yesterday was a key date for that extension as well. Right? Geno Smith was due $16 million yesterday, according to Sean Reed. Quarterback Geno Smith is due a $16 million roster bonus today, which was yesterday. The Las Vegas Raiders has to pay that money today, but it can essentially fold it into a larger signing bonus if he gets an extension as expected. It's interesting when you think about this report. So when the Raiders traded for Geno Smith, we already knew that Geno Smith was going to get $16 million guaranteed the 5th day of the league year, right? Or 5 days after the league year essentially started. And what's interesting about that is, yes, you could technically fold the $16 million into a larger extension into the future. But what's interesting about that is you would expect a owner like Mark Davis to say, hey, I don't want to pay him $16 million unless I have to. I want that extension done as soon as possible. Because Geno Smith's not playing without an extension, right? I think Raider fans have to understand this concept. Geno Smith got traded from the Seahawks because he wanted a new contract. And the Raiders said, we will give you that contract, come over to the Raiders, which means Geno Smith's going to get a contract extension at some point this week. Or at least at some point, right? We don't know when that's going to happen. Because Geno Smith still, at least as of yesterday, he was still in Florida. And maybe that changes today. Maybe this is the week he ends up back in Vegas, but it's interesting nonetheless. All right, Geno Smith got the $16 million. He'll sign a contract at some point, and he's not going to get $16 million less than that guaranteed money. Geno Smith's still going to end up getting paid out. If it was $100 million guaranteed, he's still going to get $100 million. He's not going to say, hey, give me $86 million since you paid me $16 million a week ago. That's not going to happen. Right? And I just find it interesting that Geno Smith has not been to Vegas. He has not got that contract taken care of. As of yesterday, he was still in Florida. And who knows, maybe that image was taken 2 days ago or 3 days ago. But it's interesting nonetheless because you would think that contract would get taken care of as soon as possible. Geno Smith, you guys can see the contract here. The $31 million against the cap does not change. The roster bonus, $16 million, officially kicked in already. So at this point, if Geno Smith and the Raiders can't agree to a contract and Geno says, trade me or release me, the Raiders will have to technically pay him $16 million. And I don't expect that to actually happen. I guess just never say never, but I don't expect that to actually happen. Right? I expect Geno Smith to be the quarterback and the Raiders to actually rework his contract. I think he'll get 2 or 3 extra years onto his contract. I think the report was that the Seahawks offered him, I think, $40 million. And again, $40 million, saying, hey, we offered him $40 million on average. That's one thing. The guaranteed money is also another. The Seahawks could have said, hey, we're only going to guarantee you 1 year. And he might have said, I want both years guaranteed, right? So things like that can also kind of throw it off. I think Geno's going to get around 40 to 45. I think that's kind of what his market is at this point. And the Raiders are obviously willing to pay that, right? Because they've already made the trade. They haven't done the extension. It would have made sense for them to trade and do the extension. But at this point, the Raiders have kind of given that leverage away. Geno Smith has the leverage at this point, essentially, right? But it is interesting, nonetheless, kind of getting to that first point. Should the Raiders go out there and try to bring in Sheduer Sanders? Sheduer Sanders is a quarterback that's really seen his stock fall, right? He's absolutely tanked. And I think he's partly to blame himself, right? If I'm being 100% honest, I think him not going to the East-West Shrine and not throwing, the combine not throwing, I think those type of things do impact your stock, no matter how you look at it. Yeah, if you're a top 2 or 3 quarterback, in terms of picks, right? Like if you're the first or second overall pick, and you're guaranteed to be that because of your tape, it makes sense not to go to the East-West Shrine. It makes sense not to throw at the combine. And I think the combine throwing's a little bit less. I think the East-West Shrine and playing in that game is regarded a lot higher, right? We saw Bo Nix as a great example go to the Senior Bowl. Josh Allen go to the Senior Bowl. And these two guys end up having great NFL careers. And more than that, they end up being top, 11 to 12 picks. And I think Sheduer Sanders could have definitely shored himself up as a top 10 pick. And I think at this point, he's not going to go in the top 10. I think there's a chance he's not even going to go ahead of Jackson Dart. I think there's a chance Jackson Dart ends up getting drafted ahead of him. Not saying that I would personally agree with that. I'm just saying I think based off of what we're hearing from guys like Mel Kiper, what we're hearing from some of the insiders as well, right? Like Adam Schefter and Rappaport have kind of talked about this. Todd McShay's talked about it too, right? I think the NFL draft guys, Mel Kiper, Todd McShay, have talked about the stock dipping a little bit. And I think for the Raiders, Sheduer Sanders is going to be there with pick 6. Would it be a smart thing to do where the Raiders have brought in Geno Smith, they're going to pay him for the next 2 to 3 years? Is it smart to spend that 6th overall pick on a quarterback of the future? I think it'd be bad value, truth be told. I think if Geno Smith was making $10 million a year for the next 3 years, draft a quarterback if you want. But I think when you're paying a guy $40 million, is bad value because at some point, if Geno Smith throws an interception down the line, every person's going to say, bring in Sheduer Sanders, right? For Geno Smith's entire time with the Raiders, if you have that backup quarterback that you take with the 6th overall pick, he's the future. No one's going to care about Geno Smith, right? Everybody's going to look forward to the future. Every interception, every bad decision, throw in Sheduer Sanders. More than just that element of it, if the Raiders want to win a Super Bowl with Geno Smith as your quarterback, you got to spend as many of these picks as you can on talent, right? We saw last year when the Raiders took Brock Bowers and Jackson Powers-Johnson, how that impacted the team as we kind of went into it. Brock Bowers was probably our best pass catcher pretty quickly, and Jackson Powers-Johnson was our best offensive lineman last year. And I think as we go into this season, Powers-Johnson's going to be one of the top 2 or 3 centers in the NFL. Brock Bowers one of the top 2 or 3 tight ends. That right there is going to help Geno Smith, right? You got your center with Geno Smith. You got that option in Brock Bowers for Geno Smith. I think it'd be smart to potentially add a wide receiver, another target for Geno, a guy that could be game changer. Maybe you add a corner or a defensive lineman, right? And that helps, because the defense steps up, right? And the defense is legit. I think for the Raiders, you take that first pick you have, right, 6th overall pick, bring in a wide receiver, bring in a defensive end, get an impact player. With your second pick you have, bring a guard in, get another impact player or a running back, right? That's going to benefit Geno Smith more than saying let's bring in a quarterback of the future. I think the Raiders got to go all in these next 2 to 3 years that they've kind of brought in Geno Smith. Chances are it's probably not going to win a Super Bowl, right? Geno Smith hasn't actually proven he's a Super Bowl quarterback. But more than that, 20% of the time, this type of stuff works. We saw it with the Jets. It did not work out when they brought in Aaron Rodgers. We saw it with the Falcons this past season when they went all in with Kirk Cousins. 2 years ago, the Saints went all in with Derek Carr. None of that worked out. But we have seen this happen with Tom Brady and Peyton Manning when they went to the Broncos and the Bucks, and those teams won Super Bowls. So I know Geno Smith isn't those guys, but hopefully this works out for the Raiders. I'd go all in to try to win that Super Bowl now. And I know that might be a little hopeful thinking, right? Saying like, hey, let's try winning a Super Bowl. But you don't go all in on a veteran quarterback unless you're in that boat, right? If you wanted to rebuild, you should have traded Maxx, got the draft capital, and then draft that quarterback this year, or tank this year and draft that quarterback next year, and then go down that path, right? But that's not what the Raiders picked. So we'll see what ends up happening, right? I find it interesting, however you kind of look at it, right? Geno Smith hasn't been in the building. On top of Geno Smith not being in the building, we'll see if he kind of shows up there at some point this week and gets that extension. At the same time, I'm out on Shedeur personally. At least not in the first round. If he's there in the second round, I'd highly consider that. But I also want to just wrap this up and talk a little bit about the free agency that the Raiders had in the first week of free agency. So we obviously lost some of our key players. We also went out and signed some players as well, right? And I kind of want to just go through it. So the Raiders at this point have made a ton of moves, right? And I think some people don't realize all the different things that happened last week because no one cares, truth be told, about, Charles Snowden and Matthew Butler. So we're not going to really talk about it. But the Raiders did sign a lot of their own guys, right? The Raiders obviously over the last 2 weeks have been busy bringing in some of their own guys. And this makes a lot of sense, right? When you have 27 free agents, a third of those are going to be your own players that you're going to eventually bring back. Right, and truth be told, we're probably going to sign a couple more guys out here with the Raiders. Last year, this year, we'll bring them back. But let's just talk about some of these moves that the Raiders made. So first and foremost, Charles Snowden, Jordan Meredith, Matthew Butler, Muwaga, Isaiah Polamau, Sam Webb, Malcolm Koonce, Adam Butler. Are guys that were with the Raiders last year that we obviously brought back. And I think the big ones is Malcolm Koonce and Adam Butler. But the other one that's kind of interesting to me is Matthew Butler, right? Matthew Butler came out of Tennessee. He was a fifth-year player when he came out. He had so much potential, so much upside. He only had a good fifth year, right? The first 4 years, he wasn't that good. But he had a monster fifth year, and because of that, he ended up getting drafted by the Raiders. I believe he was a fifth-round pick when the Raiders drafted him. And I remember, I think we drafted Neil Farrow a round earlier. But Matthew Butler was a fifth-round pick. Raiders bring him in. A ton of upside, but he's never really developed, right? And he ends up spending, I believe, 3 years with the Raiders at this point. I think this next year is going to be year 4. And although he wasn't a restricted free agent, right, which means he's like free to go wherever he wants, the Raiders still chose to bring him back as opposed to releasing him and just kind of letting him be. And again, he's 26 years old. I think his best football is still in front of him. And I love the fact that the Raiders actually brought him back. I think he's a good football player. He hasn't proven it and put it together yet, but the potential is definitely there. And I think for the Raiders, you got to bet on potential with some of these younger guys. When a guy's 26 years old, you got to bet on the upside, right? You've had him for a couple of years. You've seen kind of what he's like inside the building. You know what he looked like in the past. Hopefully it kind of clicks for Matthew Butler this year. Again, low risk contract, right? It's just $1,030,000. So very, very low risk contract. Last year, he only played 9% of snaps. We'll see this year if he can potentially carve out a bigger role for himself. Remember, with Adam Butler, it took him time until he became that player he is today. Another player that we did bring back is also Jordan Meredith. We've kind of already talked about this, but again, a low risk, high upside, right? $1,030,000. That's backup money right there, right? That's rotational. So it's a good signing, however you kind of look at it. But we also did bring in a bunch of people from other teams, and I kind of want to talk about some of these different guys, some of the roles that these guys might have, especially based off the contracts that these guys are actually going to end up getting. So let's just get into this. So Lonnie Johnson Jr., safety, coming over from the Panthers. We don't have the actual value of the contract, although I think it was reported somewhere. I saw on Twitter. It's a low valued contract. I think it's around $2 to $3 million. So it's nothing crazy. Lonnie Johnson's best football could still be in front of him, right? This guy's a guy that was banged up a ton, right? He hasn't been very productive. Part of that has been because he's been banged up. But he does have traits on tape that made the Raiders feel like, hey, if this guy could be healthy, he could be a good football player. Lonnie Johnson's played a little bit of corner, specifically in the slot. There's a chance this guy ends up competing as a slot corner for the Raiders. He's long, he's lengthy, he can hit you. And he's a guy that's, has like 4 or 5 interceptions in his career. And keep in mind, he doesn't play a whole lot, right? He's kind of been unhealthy over the course of his career. It's a good pickup for the Raiders. Again, low risk, high upside, especially given if the contract is actually only in the $2 to $3 billion range. I think there's potential with Lonnie Johnson. The guy that I really like is going to be Eric Stokes. The Raiders obviously brought him in last week from the Packers. He's another guy that is a low risk, high upside type of player. He was a first round pick just a couple years back. I think 2019 he was a first round pick. But more than just being a first round pick, this guy was very, very good his first 2 years. And that was under a completely different defensive coordinator. The Packers had a couple of changes on the defensive side, and it just never really clicked for him. He never really developed. But if there's one thing the Raiders have on this coaching staff, with Patrick Graham specifically, is a guy that can take corners and really turn them around, right? We've seen some corners come on into the Raiders system and have success. And of course, I also have to just kind of throw this out there. Cornerback, safeties, it's a hard position to evaluate because oftentimes you're not seeing what's happening when the play's going on. When the ball gets snapped and you're watching that play, you're seeing the quarterback, you're seeing the defensive lineman, the offensive lineman. You're not seeing what's happening on the back end. But Patrick Graham runs an elite scheme, and I study it all the time. I put the tape on, I watch these guys all the time. Our scheme and system makes it very, very hard. They're confusing guys. They're rotating in and out, 3 high to 2 high. They're doing a lot of different things, and it's because of what Patrick Graham does, and that's confusing to a quarterback. To me, Patrick Graham runs in a very, very elite scheme, and he's had success with different corners. And I think with Eric Stokes coming to the Raiders, there's upside here with Stokes. Now, I don't know the exact value, but again, I think this one might be on the higher end. I think he might have gotten like $4 to $5 million. Again, it's not confirmed, which is why the number's not in here. But I love this pickup for the Raiders. $4 to $5 million to me means that he's going to be a guy that's competing to start. I would think Ja'Cory Benning and Jack Jones ends up kind of being the 2 guys to start. And then Eric Stokes will compete and potentially take over for Jack or Ja'Cory, whichever guy he can end up beating out. But he's a guy that's going to compete. And again, injuries happen, so he's a guy that will play a lot this year. Another guy that we ended up signing is Landon Roberts. I watched a lot of Roberts tape, and I'm very excited to see what Roberts can do with the Raiders. Now, of course, the lazy comp is to say, hey, Robert Spillane came over from the Steelers. Roberts comes over from the Steelers. Roberts is going to be the next Robert Spillane, and that's a lazy comparison to make, right? Landon Roberts is 31 today. When Robert Spillane came to the Raiders, he was like 27. In fact, Roberts today is older than Spillane was when Spillane came to the Raiders like 3 years ago. Let's talk about some of what Roberts will bring to the Raiders. I do think that the Raiders scheme and system is going to look a lot different this year. I think we're going to have a lot more parts of the Pete Carroll scheme and system, right? And I think we'll bring in some assistant coaches as well that were with Pete, guys, unofficial coaches that aren't going to be actually listed on the website. I think there's a chance that we're going to end up bringing in guys that, bring over that Pete Carroll scheme and system. Now, of course, I think it'll still be Patrick Graham's 2 high shell for the most part. But I will not be surprised to see more, cover 3, more stacked boxes, and more guys like Roberts where you're trying to defend the run, right? Roberts is very, very good against the run. I've been watching a lot of this guy's tape, right? He's solid against the run. He's strong. He's physical at the point of attack. He's a tone setter. And that's kind of what the Raiders have been bringing in. They've been bringing in some tone setters. And that's one of the things I like with some of these moves that the Raiders have brought in. Eric Stokes is 6'1". Landon Roberts, physical as hell. Jeremy Chin is like 6'3". Isaiah Pola-Mao, who we've retained, is all 6'4". To me, it seems like Pete Carroll has a type of guy that he wants to bring in. It's the long, lengthy, physical players. And Roberts is more physical than most linebackers in the NFL, in my opinion. Now, that doesn't mean he's going to be great in coverage. It doesn't mean it's going to translate to the Raiders having the best defense in the NFL. But Roberts does have potential. He does have some upside. And I personally like the pickup. It's only $3 million, right? To me, that's rotation. That's backup. But the guy that's not being paid to rotate in and not to be a backup is going to be Jeremy Chin. Jeremy Chin is going to get $8 million a year with the Raiders. And really, this is just a 1-year contract, right? If this guy was the worst safety in the NFL, the Raiders can release him next year, and we only lose $4 million. I don't think that's what this is. I think they're going to keep him for the 2 years. But you can see he's guaranteed $12.2 million. The average is 8.1. Again, this year he'll count $8 million. And then there's $4 million remaining that's kind of guaranteed next year. So you can release him and only lose $4 million. I don't think we're going to do that. I think worst case scenario, you just keep him as a backup unless you really, really needed the money. But Jeremy Chin getting $8 million to me means that this guy is looked at as a starting safety for the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, it will be interesting to note, is Jeremy Chin an actual starting safety or is he a starting linebacker? And we're going to find that out pretty quickly because last year, this guy played a lot more as a guy that's inside the box, right? As a linebacker, as a guy playing on the edge. He played that way more last year than he did as a true safety. So it will be interesting to see what this guy does. And I'll be honest, he's really not that good in coverage. He's a little slow to get to the spot. He's kind of like Isaiah Pola-Mao in that instance, right? Both guys are going to be a little slow to get to the spot. But I almost feel like there's a chance Jeremy Chin is kind of brought in where he can help mold a guy like Isaiah Pola-Mao, potentially get Isaiah Pola-Mao to play a little bit better. And they can kind of play the same position. Guys can kind of switch back and forth. And you can still put them out there together on the field, right? It will be interesting to see how the Raiders utilize both of those guys. I would be surprised to see both guys be our actual starting safeties or like the two high safeties. I'd be surprised that if those two guys are the guys. I think the Raiders will struggle in coverage. That's my personal opinion, based off of watching the tape of both of those guys. The last guy we brought in is going to be Alex Kappa. This one's really a one-year contract. This is a guy that basically was a full-time starter for the Bengals last year. This is a guy that I'm not too excited about, right? This is a guy that, he's smart, he's efficient, and yeah, I understand there's a spot for those type of players in the NFL. But Alex Kappa is also the type of guy where Chris Jones lines up in front of him, Chris Jones is going to beat him like that. Right? That key 3rd and 8 situation in the goal line, the Raiders are down 4 points, you got to score a touchdown. Alex Kappa's the type of guy that's going to get beat by Chris Jones. And I understand Chris Jones is going to beat most offensive linemen. But if you're the Raiders, you can't have Chris Jones being able to beat Alex Kappa on one side and then go to the other side. And he can also beat Dylan Parham or Jordan Meredith, whoever's kind of in there. To me, you got to have guys that can kind of hold their own against guys like Chris Jones. And I know that's a hard thing to get to, but I mean, is it even that hard, truth be told, right? I think if you put the investments in, you can get good interior offensive linemen pretty quickly. The Eagles do it every year, right? The Eagles, for years, just kind of thinking back, you go back, they had Isaac Samalo, who I think they took in like the 5th round, playing guard. They had, then they went out and drafted Landon Dickerson in the 2nd round. He comes in and plays guard. They draft Tyler Steen to replace Samala. They go out there and bring in Mekhi Becton. They bring in Kenyon Green, right? They're just rotating guards. If you put the investments in, it's easy to bring these guys in. I'm not too high on Alex Kappa, but it is just a 1-year contract. Plus, maybe the Raiders just aren't high on what the Raiders had last year at the guard position, right? Or at least this new regime. We'll see what ends up happening, but that's kind of the transactions that the Raiders have made. Let me know what you guys think, man. What do you guys think about Geno Smith? You guys think that extension gets done this week? And what are your thoughts on week 1 of the free agency? Let me know down in the comments below. Thumbs up, subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time with another video.